The letter from Liverpool. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of the Montgomery household in Charleston, South Carolina, casting delicate shadows across the breakfast table. Margaret Maggie Montgomery, a woman of 43 with silver threads beginning to weave through her auburn hair, sat reading a letter that had crossed the Atlantic. Her hands trembled slightly as she absorbed the words penned by her childhood friend, Eleanor Hastings, now living in Liverpool, England. "The children are growing thin," Eleanor had written in her neat, careful script. "We queue for hours for a single egg. The meat ration barely feeds a mouse, and butter is but a distant memory. I fear we are forgetting what proper nourishment means. The government pamphlets tell us to make do, but Margaret, I confess I don't know how much longer we can endure on boiled turnips and gray bread." Maggie set down the letter and gazed out the window at her garden, abundant with vegetables, herbs, and fruit trees. The contrast struck her like a physical blow. While her world remained relatively untouched by the deprivations of war, her dear friend across the ocean was suffering. She thought of Eleanor's 3 children, whom she'd met during the Hastings visit to America in 1938, just before the world had changed forever. Her daughter, Rose, entered the kitchen, her nurse's uniform crisp and white. At 22, Rose had inherited her mother's determination and her late father's practical mind. "Mother, you look troubled. Is it news from England?" Maggie handed her the letter. As Rose read, her expression shifted from concern to determination. "There must be something we can do," she said finally. "The boys are fighting over there, but what about the women and children? Who's fighting for them?" That evening, Maggie sat at her writing desk, surrounded by her grandmother's old recipe books. These weren't the modern cookbooks with their reliance on abundant ingredients and convenience. These were the recipes from harder times, from the Civil War era and Reconstruction, when Southern women had learned to make miracles from almost nothing. Recipes that used every part of every ingredient, that stretched small amounts of meat or made desserts without sugar, that preserved and pickled and made something delicious from what others might discard. As she turned the yellowed pages, written in her grandmother's spidery handwriting, an idea began to form. These recipes were born from necessity, from times when Southern families had faced their own desperate shortages. Her grandmother had survived on creativity, resourcefulness, and the wisdom passed down through generations of women who refused to let their families starve, no matter the circumstances. "Mock apple pie made from crackers," she read aloud. "Depression cake with no eggs, milk, or butter. Vinegar taffy. Potato candy." Each recipe told a story of resilience, of women who had faced adversity and emerged with their dignity and ingenuity intact. Maggie picked up her pen and began to write. "Dearest Eleanor, I believe I may have something that can help." She didn't know it yet, but this letter would set in motion a remarkable journey. Within weeks, Maggie would gather a group of Southern women, her neighbors, her church circle, the ladies of the Historical Society, and together they would embark on a mission that would cross an ocean and touch thousands of lives. They would resurrect forgotten recipes, revive lost culinary wisdom, and prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon in war isn't wielded on a battlefield, but in a kitchen by women who refuse to surrender to despair. As Maggie sealed the envelope, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since her husband's death 2 years prior. The war had taken so much from so many. Perhaps it was time to give something back. Gathering the circle. 3 days after sending her letter to Eleanor, Maggie Montgomery stood in the parlor of the Charleston Women's Society, facing a room full of curious faces. She'd called an emergency meeting, and the turnout exceeded her expectations. 37 women, ranging from young mothers to grandmothers, had assembled, their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Ladies," Maggie began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I've gathered you here today because I believe we have a duty that extends beyond rolling bandages and knitting socks for our soldiers. We have knowledge, precious knowledge, that could save lives across the Atlantic." She held up her grandmother's recipe book, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling. "My friend Eleanor Hastings writes to me from Liverpool. She describes children going hungry, mothers unable to provide adequate nutrition despite their best efforts. The British rationing system provides survival, but barely. Meanwhile, we Southerners carry within us the wisdom of generations who survived on very little. Martha Reynolds, the eldest member of the society at 78, spoke up. You're talking about the old ways. The recipes our mothers and grandmothers used during the war between the states and after. Her voice carried the weight of personal memory. My mama could make a feast from a handful of cornmeal and some dandelion greens. We thought those days were behind us. They were, Maggie agreed, but that knowledge is more valuable now than ever. Not here, perhaps, but in England, where families are struggling to survive on rations that would shock us. An adult there receives 4 ounces of bacon per week. 4 ounces? 1 egg if they're lucky. 2 ounces of butter. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs of disbelief. Young Dorothy Chun, married to a soldier stationed in the Pacific, spoke up. That's impossible. How can anyone live on that? They're managing, Maggie said, but just barely. That's where we come in. I propose we gather every recipe, every technique, every clever substitution our families have used to create nourishment from scarcity. We'll compile them, organize them, and find a way to get them to the women of Britain. Over the next 2 hours, the women debated, planned, and ultimately committed to what they began calling the Recipe Project. They divided into committees. One to gather recipes from throughout Charleston and the surrounding counties, another to test and standardize the recipes to ensure they would work with British ingredients and measurements, and a third to handle correspondence with potential contacts in England. Sarah Beth Williams, whose sharp mind had made her the unofficial treasurer of every organization she'd ever joined, raised a practical concern. Collecting recipes is one thing, Maggie, but getting them to England is another. We can't just mail thousands of recipes across an ocean at war. I've thought about that, Maggie replied. We'll need to compile them into a proper booklet, something practical that can be reproduced and distributed. And we'll need connections in England, women's organizations, churches, community centers. Eleanor is helping me identify contacts in Liverpool, but we'll need more. Rose Montgomery stepped forward. Mother, I may be able to help. At the hospital, we work with the Red Cross. They have established channels to Britain. If we can demonstrate the value of this project, they might help with distribution. The enthusiasm in the room was palpable. Women who had felt helpless in the face of global conflict suddenly saw a way to contribute meaningfully. They weren't soldiers or factory workers, but they had skills and knowledge that could make a real difference. Before the meeting adjourned, each woman committed to bringing at least 10 recipes to the next gathering, along with the stories behind them. As they filed out, chattering excitedly, Maggie felt both exhilarated and overwhelmed. She had started something significant, but the path ahead was unclear. Martha Reynolds lingered behind, gripping Maggie's hand with surprising strength. This is good work you're doing, child. My grandmother survived Sherman's March. She fed 7 children on next to nothing and never let them see her cry. That kind of strength deserves to be remembered and shared. You're doing more than sending recipes. You're sending hope. The wisdom of scarcity. Within 2 weeks, Maggie's dining room had been transformed into what Rose jokingly called Command Central. The large mahogany table that had hosted countless family dinners now groaned under the weight of recipe cards, handwritten notes, and worn cookbooks. Recipes arrived daily, some mailed from distant relatives, others hand-delivered by neighbors who had heard about the project through the Charleston grapevine. Each recipe came with a story. Mrs. Abernathy from Broad Street contributed her mother's war cake, a rich, dark fruit cake made without eggs, milk, or butter, ingredients that had been scarce during the First World War. Mama made this every Christmas from 1917 through 1920, she'd written. It was so good that we kept making it long after the war ended. Nobody missed those eggs one bit. From the rural areas outside Charleston, farmers' wives sent recipes that showcased remarkable creativity. Potato chocolate cake used mashed potatoes to create moisture and texture. Mock chicken transformed pork or veal into something that resembled poultry through careful seasoning and preparation. Depression candy, made sweets from potatoes and powdered sugar, ingredients far more available during rationing than chocolate or refined sugar. The testing committee, led by Rose and her friend Patricia Dawson, worked tirelessly in Maggie's kitchen. They had to convert measurements from a handful and a pinch into something more standardized. They substituted ingredients to match what they knew was available in Britain. Where American recipes called for molasses, they noted that British cooks could use treacle. Cornmeal recipes were adapted to use oats or barley flour, more readily available in England. One afternoon, as Rose was testing a vinegar pie, a surprisingly delicious dessert that used no dairy products, Maggie received a telegram from Eleanor. Her hand shook as she opened it. Stop Recipe Project, brilliant stop, contacted Liverpool Women's Volunteer Service, stop desperate, for help stop, can you come stop Eleanor? Maggie read it 3 times, her heart pounding. Come to England? Cross the Atlantic, while German U-boats prowled the waters? The idea was both terrifying and thrilling. Rose entered, wiping flour from her hands. Mother? What is it? Maggie handed her the telegram. Rose's eyes widened as she read. You're going to go, aren't you? I don't know if I can. The danger. The danger is exactly why you must go, Rose interrupted. Mother, you've spent 2 years since Daddy died, just existing. This project has brought you back to life. And those women in England need more than recipes on paper. They need someone to show them, to teach them, to give them hope in person. That evening, the core committee gathered in Maggie's parlor for an emergency meeting. When she shared Eleanor's telegram, the response was unanimous and immediate. You must go, Martha Reynolds declared. And you shouldn't go alone. By the end of the evening, a plan had formed. A delegation of 4 women would travel to England. Maggie, as the project leader, Rose, whose nursing skills might be useful, Martha, whose lifetime of cooking experience and authority would lend credibility, and Sarah Beth Williams, whose organizational abilities and no-nonsense personality would keep them all on track. The logistics were daunting. They needed travel permits, passage on a ship, permission from military authorities, and funding for the journey. But the women of Charleston rallied. The Historical Society donated funds. The Red Cross expedited their applications. A local shipping company with military contracts found them space on a convoy vessel departing in 6 weeks. As preparations intensified, the recipe collection grew. They now had over 300 recipes, each one tested and annotated with detailed instructions. Maggie began organizing them into categories: soups and stews, main dishes, breads and biscuits, desserts and sweets, preservation techniques, and what they called stretching strategies, ways to make small amounts of ingredients feed many mouths. One recipe particularly moved Maggie. It came from an elderly woman named Josephine Rutledge, whose family had been enslaved on a plantation outside Charleston. Her recipe for ash cake and survival stew included a note: my grandmother taught my mother, and my mother taught me. When you have almost nothing, you use everything. Even in the worst times, we never wasted a thing. Every peel, every bone, every leaf had purpose. That's how we survived. Maggie included the recipe with deep respect, recognizing that survival wisdom transcended race and history. These were lessons born from necessity, refined through generations, and now needed again in a different land, under different circumstances. The Atlantic crossing. The SS Merchant's Pride was not designed for passenger comfort. It was a cargo vessel, part of a military convoy crossing the Atlantic, and the 4 women from Charleston occupied what was essentially a converted storage room below deck. 2 sets of narrow bunk beds, a small table, and a single porthole constituted their living quarters for the 12-day journey. On their second day at sea, Maggie learned the true meaning of fear. The convoy traveled in strict blackout conditions, zigzagging across the ocean to avoid German U-boats. The ship's engines created a constant rumble that vibrated through the metal walls, and every unexpected sound sent her heart racing. Rose, in the bunk above her mother, whispered in the darkness, "Are you awake?" "I haven't slept properly since we left port," Maggie admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I imagine torpedoes." "Then let's not close our eyes." Let's work. In the dim light of a carefully shielded lantern, they reviewed their recipes, making final notes and adjustments. The other passengers, mostly military personnel and essential workers, grew curious about the 4 Southern women traveling to England. When word spread about their mission, they found an unexpected audience. Lieutenant James Carpenter, a young officer from Boston, approached them in the mess hall on the 3rd day. "Ma'am, I couldn't help overhearing about your recipe project. My wife is in London, working as a translator. She writes about the food situation. It's dire. What you're doing, it matters more than you might realize." Others shared similar stories. A merchant marine described his sister's struggles feeding 3 children in Manchester. A Red Cross worker talked about the malnutrition she'd witnessed in British hospitals. Each conversation reinforced the importance of their mission while highlighting the scale of the challenge they faced. Martha Reynolds, despite her age, proved to be the sturdiest of them all. While Maggie and Sarah Beth battled seasickness during rough weather, Martha remained unaffected, telling stories of her childhood and teaching younger crew members to play gin rummy. "I survived 78 years of life's storms," she said with a wry smile. "I'm not about to let a little ocean water upset me." On the 7th day, the convoy encountered a genuine threat. The alarm sounded at 3 a.m. A submarine had been detected. The women huddled in their cabin as the ship's crew rushed to battle stations. For 2 hours, they sat in darkness, holding hands, praying silently as depth charges exploded in the distance. The sound was unlike anything Maggie had ever heard, deep, resonating booms that seemed to come from the belly of the ocean itself. When the all-clear finally sounded, they found themselves shaking but unharmed. Sarah Beth, usually so composed, broke down crying. "I have 3 children at home," she sobbed. "What was I thinking coming on this journey?" Rose put her arm around the older woman. "You were thinking that somewhere in England, there are other mothers with 3 children who need our help. That's what you were thinking." The near miss changed something among them. The theoretical danger had become viscerally real, and yet they pressed on. They had committed to this mission, and Southern women didn't abandon their commitments. To occupy their minds during the remaining days, they organized an impromptu cooking class in the ship's galley. The cook, a gruff man named Murphy who hailed from Dublin, was initially skeptical but became intrigued when Maggie showed him how to make vinegar pie. "You're telling me I can make a proper dessert without milk, eggs, or butter?" he asked incredulously. "I'm not telling you," Maggie replied with a smile. "I'm showing you." By the time they reached British waters, Murphy had learned a dozen recipes and promised to share them with his wife back in Ireland. More importantly, several crew members who had family in Britain had carefully copied recipes to take home. On the morning of the 12th day, they woke to changed sounds. The engines had quieted, and voices shouted commands above deck. They scrambled up to find the ship entering Liverpool's harbor. The city skyline was different from Charleston's, darker, harder, bearing visible scars from German bombing raids. But as the ship drew closer, Maggie saw something that made her heart swell. On the dock, among the workers and military personnel, stood a small group of women holding a hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome to Liverpool, Southern Sisters." Eleanor Hastings stood at the center of the group, older and thinner than Maggie remembered, but smiling with tears streaming down her face. The reality of rationing. The house on Myrtle Street in Liverpool bore the genteel shabbiness of wartime Britain. Eleanor Hastings' once elegant home now showed signs of necessary neglect. Peeling paint, windows covered with brown tape to prevent shattering during air raids, and a front garden transformed into a vegetable patch. Inside, the furniture was worn but immaculately clean, and despite the scarcity, Eleanor had prepared tea for her guests. Maggie stared at the offering, weak tea with no sugar, a small plate of thin crackers, and margarine so pale it was almost white. This was Eleanor's idea of hospitality, and Maggie realized with a pang that her friend had probably used her entire week's ration to provide even this modest refreshment. "Eleanor, you shouldn't have," Maggie began, but her friend raised a hand. "Nonsense. I have guests from America. Standards must be maintained." She smiled, but Maggie could see the strain behind it. Besides, you'll need to understand what we're working with if your recipes are to help us. Over the next several hours, Eleanor explained the British rationing system in detail. Each person received a ration book with coupons for various foods. The weekly allowance per adult was stark: 4 ounces of bacon or ham, 2 ounces of butter, 2 ounces of cheese, 4 ounces of margarine, 3 pints of milk, 8 ounces of sugar, and 2 ounces of tea. Meat was rationed by price rather than weight, amounting to about 1 shilling and tuppence worth per week, roughly enough for a small roast that had to last a family of 4 for 7 days. But that's not even the worst of it, Eleanor continued. Fresh fruits are nearly impossible to find. Eggs are scarce. We're lucky to get 1 per person per week, if that. Onions are like gold. And forget about anything imported: lemons, oranges, bananas. Children are growing up never having tasted a banana. Rose pulled out her notebook, taking careful notes. What about vegetables? Whatever we can grow ourselves or find locally. The Dig for Victory campaign has turned every available plot into a garden, but variety is limited. Potatoes, cabbage, turnips, carrots. We see a lot of root vegetables. In summer, we get peas and beans if we're lucky. That evening, Eleanor arranged for the Charleston women to meet with representatives of the Liverpool Women's Voluntary Services at a local church hall. 30 women attended, their faces showing curiosity mixed with skepticism. They were tired, worn down by years of war and deprivation, and the appearance of 4 well-dressed American women promising culinary solutions struck some as tone-deaf. A woman named Gladys Morrison spoke up, her voice sharp with barely concealed resentment. Begging your pardon, but you Americans don't know what it's like. You haven't had bombs falling on your heads while you queue for bread. You haven't had to watch your children grow thin. Coming here with your recipes feels a bit presumptuous. The room fell silent. Maggie felt the weight of Gladys's words and recognized the truth in them. She stood slowly, gathering her thoughts. You're absolutely right, she said quietly. We don't know what you've endured. We haven't lived through the Blitz or stood in queues for hours or raised children on rations that barely sustain life. But what we do know, what our mothers and grandmothers knew, is hunger, not from war, but from other hardships. The American Civil War left the South devastated. My grandmother lived through times when there was nothing: no meat, no flour, no sugar, nothing but what you could forage or grow or preserve from better times. She pulled out her grandmother's recipe book, its pages soft with age. This book is filled with recipes born from desperation and refined by necessity. These aren't fancy dishes. They're survival techniques disguised as cooking. And while our hardships were different from yours, hunger is universal. Scarcity is scarcity. Martha Reynolds stood beside her. I'm 78 years old. I remember eating bark soup during Reconstruction. I remember my mother crying because she couldn't feed her children properly, and my grandmother teaching her how to make something from nothing. That wisdom didn't die with those hard times. We've carried it forward, and now we're offering it to you, not as charity, but as solidarity. From women who've suffered to women who are suffering. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Gladys Morrison's expression softened. Bark soup from Slippery Elm, Martha confirmed. Nutritious, filling, and free. Though I pray to God you'll never need to know how to make it. But if you do, well, I can teach you. The Kitchen Brigade. The Liverpool Women's Institute had loaned the Charleston delegation a community kitchen, a large, industrial space usually used for canning demonstrations and wartime cooking classes. Over the next week, this became the heart of their operation, which the local women began calling the American Kitchen Brigade. Each day began at dawn, with Maggie and her team preparing demonstrations using ingredients procured through Eleanor's ration books and those of several volunteers who had pooled their resources. The reality of working with British rations proved more challenging than anticipated. The lard wasn't quite the same as American shortening. British flour behaved differently. Even the water tasted different, affecting how breads rose and cakes baked. Rose and Patricia Dawson worked tirelessly adapting recipes in real time. When a batch of cornmeal muffins failed because British cornmeal was ground differently, they adjusted the liquid ratios and tried again. When depression cake came out too dense, They discovered that British all-purpose flour needed less mixing than its American counterpart. The breakthrough came on the third day when Maggie demonstrated what she called victory stew, a dish her grandmother had made during the hardest years after the Civil War. Using a tiny amount of bacon, the week's ration for one person, 2 potatoes, an onion, some barley, and various root vegetables, she created a pot of stew that fed 12 women generously. The secret, she explained to her rapt audience, isn't in what you have, but in how you use it. That bacon flavors the entire pot if you render the fat first and use it as your cooking base. The barley stretches it further and adds substance. Every vegetable is used completely. Peels make stock, tops and scraps go into tomorrow's soup. Nothing is wasted. One by one, the women began to understand. This wasn't about fancy cooking or American abundance. This was about fundamental survival skills elevated to an art form through necessity and experience. Mrs. Davies, a widow with 4 children, raised her hand tentatively. My mom used to say something similar during the Great War. She'd save every scrap. I'd forgotten that. When times got easier, we forgot the hard lessons. Exactly, Martha chimed in. Hard times teach hard lessons. We're just reminding you of what your grandmothers probably knew. The demonstrations grew more popular as word spread. Women brought their neighbors, who brought their friends. Within a week, they were teaching 3 sessions daily, morning, afternoon, and evening, to accommodate the different shifts women worked in factories and essential services. But it wasn't just about the recipes. As the women cooked together, shared their stories, and learned from each other, something deeper emerged. The British women began sharing their own survival techniques, tips for stretching rations, black market sources for occasional luxuries, ways to grow vegetables in bomb craters. Gladys Morrison, the woman who had initially been skeptical, became one of their most enthusiastic converts. She'd mastered depression candy, a sweet treat made from mashed potatoes and the precious sugar ration, and brought her 3 children to taste it. My youngest hasn't had proper candy in over a year, she said, tears in her eyes as she watched her daughter's face light up at the taste. I'd forgotten that it's possible to bring joy to a child's face with something made at home. We've been so focused on just surviving that we forgot about living. One afternoon, Eleanor pulled Maggie aside. You're doing more than teaching recipes, she said quietly. You're giving these women hope. They've been beaten down by years of deprivation and fear. Seeing that it's possible to create something good from almost nothing. It's changing them. But not everything went smoothly. A disaster struck on the 8th day when a demonstration of mock apple pie failed spectacularly. The crackers they'd used absorbed too much moisture, creating an inedible, soggy mess. Maggie stood before 30 disappointed women, holding a pie tin full of failure. For a moment, she wanted to cry. Then she laughed instead. Well, ladies, that's what we call a learning experience. In America, we have an expression. If at first you don't succeed, try again. Let's figure out where we went wrong and fix it. The women joined in, troubleshooting together, adjusting ingredient ratios, testing different techniques. By evening, they'd created a successful version, and the collective achievement felt sweeter than the pie itself. Beyond Liverpool, as news of the Kitchen Brigade spread beyond Liverpool, requests began arriving from other cities. Manchester, Birmingham, London, Glasgow, women's organizations across Britain wanted the Charleston delegation to visit, to teach, to share their recipes and their hope. The 4 women gathered in Eleanor's parlor to discuss their options. Their original plan had been to spend 3 weeks in Liverpool, then return home. But looking at the stack of letters and telegrams, they realized they'd underestimated both the need and their ability to help. We can't visit every city, Sarah Beth said practically. We don't have time, and quite frankly, we don't have the energy. But we can train others, Rose suggested. What if we teach women here to become instructors? Create a network of teachers who can spread this knowledge throughout Britain. Martha Reynolds nodded approvingly. Train the trainers. Smart thinking. They developed a new strategy. Instead of demonstrations for general audiences, they would conduct intensive training sessions for selected women from various cities. Women who would return home and establish their own kitchen brigades. The first training cohort consisted of 23 women from across England, Scotland, and Wales. For 2 weeks, they lived and worked together in facilities provided by the Women's Voluntary Services, learning not just recipes, but the philosophy behind them. Maggie taught them how to assess available ingredients and adapt recipes accordingly. Cooking from scarcity isn't about following recipes exactly, she explained. It's about understanding principles. Learn to substitute, to improvise, to make something from what you have rather than pining for what you don't. Rose conducted sessions on nutrition, explaining how to maximize the dietary value of limited ingredients. Your rations, while scarce, can be nutritionally adequate if you're clever about combining them. Beans and grains together provide complete protein. Root vegetables, while boring, are packed with nutrients. Even weeds, dandelion greens, nettle leaves, are edible and healthy. Martha shared stories and wisdom that went beyond mere cooking. She talked about maintaining dignity in difficult times, about the psychological importance of making food appealing even when ingredients were limited. A meal doesn't have to be abundant to be beautiful, she told them. Presentation matters. A garnish of parsley costs nothing, but makes a dish look cared for. And feeling cared for matters when the world is falling apart. Among the trainees was a young woman named Alice Patterson from London, a former schoolteacher whose sharp mind and natural leadership abilities made her an obvious candidate to lead the expansion. She absorbed every lesson, asked insightful questions, and began developing her own adaptations of the recipes for specific regional needs. In London, we have access to fish occasionally, Alice explained. Could we adapt some of these meat-stretching techniques for fish? Absolutely, Maggie replied, and together they worked out recipes for fish cakes that used mostly potatoes and breadcrumbs with just a touch of fish for flavor, and fish stews that stretched a small portion across many servings. During this intensive period, Maggie received a letter from Charleston. The recipe project had continued to grow in their absence. More recipes had been collected, tested, and organized. The Historical Society had compiled them into a booklet titled Making Do, Traditional Southern Recipes for Scarce Times, and printed 500 copies using donated paper and labor. They're sending them, Rose said excitedly, reading over her mother's shoulder. 200 copies by military transport to distribute through the Women's Voluntary Services. The booklets arrived 3 weeks later, and Maggie held one with trembling hands. It was simply bound, printed on thin wartime paper, but it represented months of collective effort from dozens of women across South Carolina. Inside were over 200 recipes, each tested and annotated, with clear instructions adapted for British measurements and ingredients. Alice Patterson flipped through the pages, her eyes widening. This is extraordinary. It's not just recipes, it's a complete survival guide. Preservation techniques, substitution charts, meal planning strategies. It's the collective wisdom of generations, Maggie said softly. And now it's yours. The graduation ceremony for the first training cohort was held at Liverpool Town Hall, a building that bore scars from bombing raids but still stood proud. Each woman received a copy of the booklet and a certificate recognizing her as a kitchen brigade instructor. More importantly, they received a network, contact information for each other, a commitment to share innovations and adaptations, and the knowledge that they weren't facing this challenge alone. But perhaps the most moving moment came when Gladys Morrison stood to speak on behalf of the British women. "You Americans came here thinking you'd teach us recipes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And you did. But you also reminded us of something we'd forgotten, that we're not helpless. That resourcefulness and creativity are as important as rations. That making do isn't just surviving. It's a form of resistance. Every good meal we create from almost nothing is a victory against the forces trying to break us." The legacy. 6 months after their arrival in Britain, Maggie stood on the deck of a ship heading back to America, watching the English coast recede into the distance. This voyage was different from their arrival, less fearful, though no less dangerous. The convoy system remained necessary. U-boats still prowled, but Maggie felt a profound sense of peace. They'd stayed far longer than planned. What was supposed to be a 3-week mission had stretched to half a year as the Kitchen Brigade concept spread across Britain. 37 cities now had active programs. Over 500 women had been trained as instructors. The recipe booklets, reproduced and distributed by the Women's Voluntary Services, had reached an estimated 50,000 British households. Rose joined her mother at the rail, linking her arm through Maggie's. Thinking about everything we've done? Thinking about everything they'll continue to do, Maggie corrected. That's the real achievement. It's self-sustaining now. They don't need us anymore. Indeed, the Kitchen Brigade had evolved beyond its American origins. British women had begun adding their own recipes and techniques to the repertoire. Alice Patterson had established a newsletter connecting instructors across the country, sharing innovations and adaptations. A woman in Scotland had figured out how to make oat-based pastries that rivaled traditional wheat versions. A group in Wales had revived ancient Celtic recipes for forage foods. Martha Reynolds had remained behind, living with Eleanor Hastings. At 78, she declared that she'd seen enough of America for one lifetime and wanted to spend her remaining years being useful. The last letter from Eleanor reported that Martha had become a beloved fixture in Liverpool, teaching not just cooking, but also telling stories of American history that fascinated British children who'd never traveled beyond their bomb cities. Sarah Beth Williams stood apart from the others, writing furiously in her notebook. She'd been documenting everything, not just recipes, but the entire experience. Someone needs to remember this, she'd said. Not just what we did, but why it mattered. As Charleston skyline came into view 2 weeks later, Maggie felt a complex mixture of emotions. Joy at coming home, sadness at leaving friends behind, and uncertainty about whether their efforts had truly made a difference in the grand scheme of a global war. The welcome at the port answered that question. Dozens of people had gathered, family members, friends, representatives from the Women's Society, and even a reporter from the Charleston Gazette. But most surprisingly, there was a small delegation from the British consulate in Washington, D.C. A diplomatic attaché approached Maggie as she disembarked. Mrs. Montgomery, on behalf of His Majesty's government, I'm instructed to convey official gratitude for your service to British civilians. The Kitchen Brigade initiative has been recognized at the highest levels as contributing significantly to civilian morale and nutrition during a critical period. That evening, at a welcome home gathering at the Women's Society, Maggie shared stories and photographs from their time abroad. But she spent most of her time listening to what had happened in Charleston during their absence. The recipe project had continued to grow. More booklets had been printed and sent to Britain, but also to other allied countries. Australian women had requested copies to help with their own rationing challenges. Even some American cities, facing their own wartime shortages, had found the recipes useful. It's become something bigger than we imagined, the Society president said. You didn't just help British women survive rationing. You reminded all of us that women have always been the keepers of essential knowledge. In times of crisis, that knowledge becomes crucial. In the years that followed, Maggie corresponded regularly with friends across Britain. She learned that the Kitchen Brigade continued long after the war ended. Even when rationing was finally lifted in 1954, many women continued using the techniques they'd learned, not from necessity, but from a recognition that waste was never wise. Alice Patterson eventually wrote a comprehensive cookbook titled The Kitchen Brigade, Wartime Recipes and Modern Variations, that became a bestseller in Britain. She credited the remarkable Southern women who reminded us that scarcity requires creativity, not surrender. Eleanor's children grew up healthy despite the war, and her daughter later became a nutritionist, inspired by what she'd witnessed during those difficult years. She often spoke publicly about how American and British women had worked together to turn deprivation into an opportunity for innovation. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was personal. Rose used her experiences to pursue a career in international public health, focusing on nutrition in crisis situations. She traveled the world, always carrying her grandmother's recipe book and her mother's lesson that the simplest gesture, sharing knowledge across an ocean, could save lives. 10 years after the war ended, Maggie received a letter from a young British woman named Catherine Morrison, Gladys Morrison's daughter, who had been just 8 years old during the Kitchen Brigade days. "I'm writing to tell you," Catherine wrote, "that my mom passed away last week. But before she did, she made me promise to write to you. She wanted you to know that learning to make something good from almost nothing changed her life. It wasn't just about food, it was about remembering her own strength. She said you taught her that hard times don't break us. They reveal what we're made of. And what we're made of, it turns out, is pretty remarkable." Maggie folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her grandmother's recipe book, now passed down to Rose, but still consulted regularly. She thought about all the women, American and British, who had come together during humanity's darkest hours, armed with nothing but old recipes and determination. They hadn't ended the war. They hadn't stopped the bombs or brought the soldiers home. But they had proven something equally important, that compassion and community could cross any ocean, that knowledge shared became strength multiplied, and that sometimes the most powerful revolutions began not with weapons, but with women in kitchens, refusing to let scarcity defeat hope. The Charleston Women's Society eventually established a permanent collection of wartime recipes and correspondence, housed in the local historical museum. Visitors still come to see the original recipe booklets, the letters from British women, and the photographs of those determined Southern ladies who carried their grandmother's wisdom across an ocean. And occasionally, when the museum docents tell the story, they mention the deeper truth that Maggie eventually came to understand. The recipes were never really about food. They were about remembering that human resilience, creativity, and solidarity are resources that never run out, no matter how scarce everything else becomes.